Hi, this is Mark Arnold with yet another episode of Fun Ideas Podcast. And today I have recurring guest Kamden Spies. I can't even say your name. And a brand new guest, but I've known him for years. Harry McCracken, how are you? Welcome
I'm
to the show.
great. Great to be with you. And hey, Camden.
How's it going?
Great, thank you.
So, I know you, Harry, from two worlds, and we'll probably talk about them as the animation world and the high tech world. So, it's like, uh, I guess I will have you introduce yourself and just kind of let us know how you got into both those diverse subjects.
Sure. Well, my day job is generally involved writing about technology, which is there's more demand for that from people willing to pay you than there is for people willing to pay you to write about comics and cartoons and so forth. But I love technology, so that hasn't been so bad. And I work for a publication called Fast Company, which is about the intersection of business, innovation, and tech. Before that, I worked for Time magazine. I had my own site called Technologizer. And way back when I worked for PC World magazine, back when there were computer magazines, there were about 300 to 400 pages.
Remember?
In the days before the World Wide Web kind of reduced the need for stuff about computers on dead trees. And I've been interested in comics and cartoons all my life. I imagine I'm pretty similar to most people with that interest in that I don't actually remember when I got interested in them, although I'm just old enough to have watched Adam West as Batman when it was first on. I was like 2. And while I don't remember doing it back then, my mother always said that I was an ardent fan, and I did not realize there was anything humorous about it. And I used to have her set an extra place at the dinner table for Robin. So I took it pretty seriously.
That's cool. And then another thing you're interested in, which hold it up, Camden. You're also you have a scrappy website too. And
That is
so
probably my biggest claim to fame. Yes, Scrappyland.
so we're Scrappy fans too. So um
Yes, I've actually just watched. I like to do things in order where I watched all the Columbia cartoons chronologically,
Wow, I like
and
Scrappy and
well,
everything else too.
all the ones that are online. I didn't watch all of them. Right?
okay.
Those that character really changes.
Totally.
The other character that changes, which I have mixed feelings about those cartoons, is the Crazy Cat ones.
Yeah, they did
Like
not really worry too
graphically,
much
but I
about
also don't like
consistency.
them that they screwed up that whole format of Harriman's strip.
Yeah, I mean, and in Columbia cartoons, sometimes they didn't even bother to care about consistency from one scene to the next.
Yeah,
You'd have 3 animators doing that, and each of them would do his own thing, and then they would just tie
yeah.
them together into a cartoon.
So let's see. I guess one of the things that I guess I first heard about you probably was either Apatoons or Animato. I don't know which came first, and I don't. You guys refresh my memory because it's been so long ago myself, and I'm kind of doing this on memory, which is fuzzy.
They certainly came out of the same era, but Apatoons was a little bit older. It goes back. I joined in 1982 when I was in high school,
Mhm,
and it was at least a few months old by then. I believe it started in 1981,
mhm,
and Animato started in the spring of 1983.
mhm.
Both products of the era when there were more and more people into animation, and even back then there was a little conversation about it going on online, but primarily it was in the context of fanzines.
Mhm. And did you start Animato
No,
mainly because? Oh,
oh,
did,
I,
oh,
should, I should say I thought you were asking me if I started, and the answer to that is no. But complete the question, and then I'll try to clarify
okay.
things.
So Michael Ventrella started it. Then I get that mixed up. Like I said, I should have done my research, but it doesn't say this stuff online, so it's like I have to do it from memory. So should have had him here to tell how it started. But I think I have asked him about that before, and that it was kind of like a response to the late lamented David Nimru's Animania slash Mind Rot, which Q Camden, he'll hold up an issue there. Yeah, is so. But when you
Which Mark gave to me.
Yes, I gave him one of those because I figured he should have the honor of having one roughly about the same age when I bought it originally. So when you took over Animato, since now we remember the order of things around here, was it still the smallish size, like the digest size, like Animato, or did you bring it full size immediately, or what was the story on that?
It was originally a digest, and
Right.
Mike did start Animato along with a friend of him named Scott Gillespie was also involved, and some other folks. And one day back then, I was at the Million Year Picnic, which was my favorite comic book store in the Boston area, and it's still my favorite comic book store. It's still there.
Oh, good.
And I saw an ad for a screening of cartoons. I believe it was, I guess it might have just been the best cartoons of all time or something general like that. And I tried to go to every cartoon screening I could because I did not have a VCR quite yet. And even if I did, there weren't all that many cartoons available. And I went there and saw that the folks who put on that screening also had put out a fanzine called Animato. And for maybe about 4 or 5 issues, I was just a reader. But then I met Mike because he had joined Appatoons. And I believe he dropped me a note, maybe with my subscription issue of Animato, saying, "Hey, I'm in the area. Give me a call." And so I became part of this Animato team. And originally, this was kind of a few years before desktop publishing was a thing. So we put it together on portable typewriters. And I still have memories of making corrections with liquid paper, and there being almost no liquid paper left in the tiny jar, and really have to scrape it to make my corrections on the page. And we took it to basically a copy shop in Harvard Square. And I thought that they had some kind of elaborate machine that would fold them and staple them. And it turned out that they just had like an army of Harvard students, and they would print them out, and then the students would fold them and staple them.
Wow.
And it got to be quite popular. I mean, we got into comic shops. One other thing I should mention, by the way, everybody assumes that Animato was kind of a response to Mindrot / Animania because the formats were basically the same, and some of the people wrote for them. But Mike says that he had not heard of Animania when he started Animato. It was just kind of a coincidence that he came up with quite a similar idea.
Was this magazine still in print though? I don't know the history, the timelines.
I mean, there was like that one last issue of Funny World that was done by the people that Mike sold it to. That was also, I think, around 1983. So
yeah,
both Animania and Funny World were kind of winding down, which was probably one reason why people liked Animato, because it was just getting started. And
if I remember right, when I look at old issues of Animation Magazine or Animation World Network, they don't do this anymore at all. But then they used to do issues like something like animation history related at one time.
I think so. My friend John Colley was involved in the original version of Animation Magazine, which was kind of more originally kind of a newsletter, and became more of a magazine. And it got to be really kind of a trade publication. So, well, there were certainly some topics that both Animato and Animation World would cover. They were like from such entirely different perspectives that that was fine. And we had the tagline, Animato, the animation fans magazine, kind of, which in retrospect did a good job of clarifying that even though we did have a lot of readers who are in the business, that's because everybody in the business is also a fan. And to get around to your question, eventually we kind of outgrew the little digest-sized format, and it turned out that, like, as your press run gets bigger and bigger, it doesn't actually get much cheaper to publish a digest, and the copy shop ended up being kind of overwhelmed by our print run, and we discovered we could go to a full size for like the same cost or maybe even less, and so we did that, and then we went to better paper and a color cover.
So who were the original? This is a question for both of you, but who were the original writers of Animato, and Appatoons really too?
Well, for Animato, there were a bunch of folks, and originally it was just like this very local Boston thing. But pretty quickly we had readers all over the country and contributors from all over. So John Colley, who kind of has been involved with kind of a lot of stuff involving animation fandom for like maybe close to 50 years, because he had a film collectors magazine in the mid 70s.
I wish he had done another volume of what I guess what Jim Corcus would later revise into the animation anecdotes on cartoon research.
Right. Yeah, they did a bunch of books together, Jim and John volunteered basically to do a West Coast news section for Animato. And he also did a ton of stuff involving connecting us with other people. From Appatoons, I did know quite a few other fans. I mean, I knew Jerry Beck and Jim Corcus and some other folks who also volunteered to write for Animato. And because Animania was winding down, there were people like G. Michael Dobbs, who had his Coco Comments column in Animania, and he just brought that over to Animato. And so we had a ton of people who were willing to help us, and it was just great.
And were you the editor all the way to the end? And I don't remember what issue that was.
No,
or did you? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, basically, at first, Mike did most of the work along with other folks like Scott, who I mentioned, and our friend Matthew Hassan also did a ton of stuff for it. And I started out just kind of writing and helping with the paste up. And also we had to put them all into envelopes and put mailing labels on them. And once we started selling to comic stores, we had to box them up. So there was a lot of production work. And I just remembered that after a while, we stopped having the copy shop staple them, I think maybe to save a little money. So we even collated them ourselves. And Mike, as you know, has a whole bunch of interests. He's into comics and cartoons, but he also was doing role-playing gaming and has a serious interest in music, and he had a band back then. So it's also, as you also know, it's very hard to do a fanzine forever. So kind of little by little, I took over more, and eventually I got access to a Mac back when the tools like PageMaker were new. And so I was able to do these nice layouts, and kind of gradually, with maybe without ever being planned that way, it went from me helping Mike to more like it being Mike helping me. And at some point I was basically the editor with some help from Mike. And then I can remember very clearly in 1991, I was sitting probably at about 2 a.m. putting together an issue. And I just sort of had a small nervous breakdown because it was so much work, and I was doing this on top of my day job. And I just and I also felt a lot of pressure to get the issue out, because we had all these people who had paid for subscriptions. And I kind of just said to myself, I'm not going to be able to do this anymore. And Mike, I kind of handed it back to Mike. And Mike, not too long thereafter, turned it over to these two guys who are also from Massachusetts, G. Michael Dobbs, who we knew very well from his Coco Comments column, and a friend of his named Patrick Duquette. And they took it over, and they did a bunch of cool things. I mean, they got it out a lot more regularly than I ever did. They got it into places like Tower Records. So the distribution went beyond comic shops. They brought in a whole bunch of new writers. So they did a great job. And that went on for, I think, about another 7 years. And then once again, it kind of ran into the issue that it's hard to keep this kind of thing going forever. And I believe they also, they got it onto newsstands, but then there was a sort of newsstand distribution meltdown. And I believe maybe they had like distributors who owed them money and so forth. And after a while, Mike also left to start his own fanzine called Animation Planet. And so I believe in 1998, Animato.
And that only lasts
down.
like a couple issues, though.
That lasted a few issues, and Patrick continued to do Animato on his own. And given how hard it is for two people to do a fanzine of that caliber, one person being in charge of something like that, which they both tried to do, was really tough. So it wound down at that point, and that was also sort of more or less at the same time that there started to be a lot of good websites about animation, and maybe like in a perfect world, Animato would have kind of morphed into being a website. Sometimes I think it would still be fun to bring it back or do something like that today, but I probably would not do it in print. Back then, like we could barely afford to do black and white illustrations on the inside, because I'd have to have them screened by a production house, and that cost about $15 each. And now today, on just the fact you can do a website and have an unlimited access to color is amazing. I also back then, like scanners were like really expensive. They were probably about $1,500 to $2,000, and so we had to pay to get stuff scanned. And eventually, desktop publishing got a lot easier, but the web would be even cooler.
I have one question about a specific issue because I have two books next to me about Maurice Noble, the one by Tom Polson and the one by what was the other one? Stepping in the Picture.
Yes.
You interviewed Maurice Noble for one issue of one of the magazines. How did that come about? I'm just curious because
Sure. Well, one of the coolest things that happened because of Animato was getting some contact with some of the legends of the industry. I mean, I feel lucky that we were doing this at a time when a fair percentage of the people who worked at Disney and Warner's and other studios in the 30s, 40s, and 50s were still around. I became good friends with Seamus Culhane, who actually wrote for us. Actually, I believe that he first wrote to us because Mike Dobbs wrote a critical review of Seamus's book, and Seamus wrote and was rather irate about it. But then we became good friends, and I visited him at his co-op in New York. And then there was this big animation auction in Philadelphia, and it was held at the time when Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson had this new book out on the making of Bambi. And in conjunction with this auction, they had a signing where Frank and Ollie and Mark Davis and Maurice all appeared. Maurice worked on Bambi, although he mainly did inspirational artwork that they didn't end up using. So you don't really see his impact on the screen, but it occupied a fairly large block of his time back then. And I took the train from Boston to Philadelphia with my friend Dave Mackey and a couple of other friends of ours, Mike Scoville and Pam Scoville, who ran something called the Animation Art Guild, which was kind of a big deal at the time. And we attended the auction and we got our autographed copies of this book. And my memory is like people were kind of all gravitating towards Frank and Ollie and maybe Mark Davis, because the 9 Old Men were such a big deal. And Maurice did not have quite so many people flocking to him. So Dave and I spent some time talking to him. And this was kind of before he kind of got as much attention as he later did as a Grandmaster of Design. So we loved talking to him. And it turned out that our friends Pam and Mike had some contacts. And so I asked them to put me in touch with Maurice. And I asked to interview him, and that turned into that cover story in the last issue of Animato I edited, and also into this really wonderful friendship I had with him from then until he passed away about 10 years later.
were you living in Philadelphia this whole time?
I lived in Boston. I got
Boston.
got to Philadelphia on the train, but I was an East Coast guy. And at first, I mean, that certainly had some impact on Animato in that we were doing it from the other side of the country of a lot of the people and history we were covering. But I did get to go out to LA occasionally. And I think especially after I did that issue, my job at PC World Magazine involved going to LA occasionally. So I would get to visit Maurice and hang out with him quite a bit.
I have a question about an issue. I don't know if you edited it. If you didn't, well, I guess you don't have the answer, and I'll just. Did you do the one? Excuse me, the issue that he had the underdog cover and interview with Joe Harris, or no?
No, that was I can't remember whether that was both Mike and Pat, or whether that was after it was just Pat who kept doing it. But
Probably
that
was both of them if that's the case.
That was one of the later issues.
Yeah.
And I should say I continued to write for Animato and to try to support it. And I thought it was cool that it continued on without me.
Right.
And
the only reason I'm mentioning that one is that actually is the one that helped me break the ice to get the other people to do my total television book, because I knew nobody. And that was like the first inkling of somebody. And then Buck and Chet wrote their underdog book, but it was just a matter of like going through, well, I can call you, and then can you give me the number for him? You probably done this yourself, and you go through everyone to get all the people that you need. So, but It was
I've
tough.
done that.
It was tough because there's no credits on those cartoons, and you had to find out. And then, but Joe Harris was the first name I ever even heard from the show, other than the voice artist. And so I'm like, huzzah! So anyway, I
I've
want to
been
thank Animato, even if you personally didn't have anything to do with it. So
I've been scanning the issues that I did do and putting them in the Internet Archive just because there is a lot of valuable history. And I would not scan those issues since they weren't mine, but I would hope that eventually all of them would be available because there is a lot of great stuff in there.
Mhm. And it's just funny. I assume if we've talked before, I assume you remember I did a fanzine about Harvey Comics, and
Totally. I mean, yeah, one of the first
I,
I grew up as a really hardcore Harvey fan, and
okay,
the fact you had a fanzine was like one of the.
and that's
I went through a long period where basically, if I went into a store to buy Harvey back issues, the sales clerks would mock me or get confused and think I was trying to sell them, and would like tell me there was nobody interested in these comics except for me. So the fact you had the fanzine was like one of the first signs there actually were other people, and it's kind of amazing to think today that um, there are a lot of those people. And then
I love it. Every time I've bought books from Mark, he wraps his books in copies of the Harveyville Fun Times.
well, no more. I don't have any left. I finally did enough of those. But yeah, there was a few issues, and you probably had this where you had a bigger print run than you anticipated distributing. And so like issue 29, I remember, is one I had tons of copies of. And it's because I went through this one printer, and I think it was because I had just lost Diamond distributing, because I managed to get into comic stores at one point and Diamond just cut me off. Boom. And so I had all these extra issues. And so I had those for years. And so, yeah, I do use them for padding if people weren't buying back issues and stuff like that. And eventually I think they're all gone now, but it's taken me, because I stopped in 2011. It's taken me 10 years to, get rid of all of them, all the excess, just doing it that
Wait,
way.
Mark, would that mean that
Yeah.
like you were probably like the last comic related fanzine other than Hogan's Alley?
Well, I was going to say that because it's Harry's bringing back memories for me. It's like, well, I stopped doing this, and if it continued on, it would have been a website. Well, I was one of these fools who kept going because honestly, I started in 1990. I probably should have stopped around 2000. You got out, or whoever was running it got out just in time, because 98, yeah, that's when internet was starting to ramp up and everything. And certainly by 2000, if you're publishing a magazine that wasn't a big, widely distributed thing, I'll just say, naming myself, you're a fool. So and I kept it going for 10 more years, and it got to the point where I had a website presence and everything, and I think the website's still up after all this time, but
It is.
yeah, but I don't update it anymore. I could, but
It is because I had to plug it. I'm doing Orrin Scott's animation bibliography.
Mhm.
Well, Harry, I'm sure you've seen it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm working with him on a web bibliography of all the websites.
Oh, cool.
Oh, okay. Well, good. I'm glad it made the cut. Anyway,
I
so
saw it on there. It still exists. It still looks like it's from 19. You haven't updated it since 98.
yeah, that's about right. Maybe a little bit later, but anyway, when I kept publishing at the tail end, I wasn't making any money off of it at all. It was like, okay, do I want to spend like $200 to $400 this month, or do I want to do it this month? That's where it got to the point. And the last few issues, I went full color. I decided just to splurge and go all out and end on a high note. So the last few issues, really hard to find really good looking magazine. But
I was
anyway.
doing Animato back in this period where there were lots and lots of animation art dealers and all these people doing like limited edition sales.
Mhm.
And so for at least a brief period, there was kind of a solid advertising base for an animation fanzine. And so we did quite well. And, our goal was never to make money. And in fact, if we had made a little bit more money than we did, it would have gone into paying the contributors, and Mike and Pat eventually did start paying, which was nice to see. One thing that Mike Ventrella taught me, which I always thought was smart, was he was like super conservative about print runs for Animato. He would like order as many as we knew we could sell, and just a little more for back issues, but he wouldn't go crazy.
Yeah.
And in fact, some of the early issues of Animato went through more than one print run, which is probably really unusual for a fanzine, just because we actually sold out and were able to sell even more. And if you're just photocopying them, it's easy enough to run off a few more copies.
That one I was a subscriber, I believe, the entire time because uh I don't know how I heard about the first issue, but I mean, there's ways people got the word out. So even with no internet back then, but I guess it was just word of mouth, and I knew it, so I was one of the charter subscribers. So I
I
got
have
them
a
all.
question for both of you.
Yeah.
How do how does a magazine like Hogan's Alley now in 2023 still stay around?
You want me
I'd
to
love to
answer?
know. I'm really glad it does because it's the kind of it's like the last vestige of
Yeah.
quality fanzines. And I mean,
Yeah,
it's I presumably it's not kept going because it's an incredible business opportunity, but through the passion and love, and they're able to put it out. I mean, it comes out once every year or two.
Yeah.
Um, I'm really glad it survives. There are like a few other things that are out there. I'm not sure if Illustration magazine is still out, but that
I know that I'm a subscriber. I don't know if y'all are a member of the Popeye fan club.
yes.
Mm.
You get their magazine, their newsletter every. They still publish theirs four
Well,
times a year,
I
and
still
they have
get
the same writers and the same website. I think they have the same. If you look at their website, they have the same website from 19. That looks like it was made when the internet was created.
I think it has to be done by somebody who is not in it for the money.
yeah.
And if you don't care about the money side, then it's still
I've been
feasible.
to that museum. That's exactly why they do it.
Yeah. I
And I know
still
that there
yeah.
are the Laurel and Hardy magazine still exists.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
The Three Stooges magazine still exists.
Yeah,
Abbott and Costello still have a magazine.
well, the Abbott Costello isn't print anymore.
Really? It's only
Yeah.
paid online?
Yeah, it's only online. It looks like a magazine, but I wanted to subscribe to it, and they go, "Well, we don't print it out anymore." And I said, "Not if I pay extra?" No. It's like, so I said, "See, I suppose I could have done it, but I still like getting. If I'm going to subscribe to something, I still want to get a physical copy."
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I still get the Three Stooges. I think I stopped for a few years for some dumb reason, but they still keep doing it. I still get Beetle Fan. That's probably the longest
Oh,
fanzine I've ever gotten. I've gotten it since 1983.
Do you get the Laurel and Hardy magazine? The Laurel and Hardy
I
magazine is
should
actually
probably get
printed in
that one. I
England.
should probably get that one.
It's actually really good. They just had a recent issue that was really cool.
I think the longest lived, if you want to call it a fanzine that I know about it, and I subscribe to it off and on too, the Baum Bugle about the Wizard of
oh
Oz. It's
wow.
been
Yeah, that's
around
a great
since
publication.
1957, and it still has black and white interior, but it has color covers,
Is it
and
about the movie or is it about
it's about
books
everything
too?
Oz, the books or
I know
anything.
the
It
Oz
even
fan club did a very nice thing for me when I did an article about Chuck Jones's Off to See a Wizard. They did a
mhm,
very nice thing on their website and they shared my article.
mhm.
It was very
Yeah, they
nice.
talked about that. Yeah, I remember that.
That was very friendly. That was very
Yeah,
nice.
so
I
they'll
appreciated
talk
that.
about anything Oz because there's a zillion things besides just the 39 movie. There's the Wiz, there's you know Return to Oz, there's all
There's
the
the
books,
18
there's
books,
comic
18
books,
different
there's
books.
You're not
graphic
going to run out of
novels.
stuff to talk about.
Yeah.
There's the Eshbaugh film,
There's a theme park.
which I think
Things.
the Eshbaugh film was going to be a movie, wasn't it?
I believe so. And they talk about unrealized things. Like they did one about the Rainbow Road to Oz, which was the uh, non-realized Disney version that was supposed to be made in the late 50s. And so it's fascinating reading stuff like that. And they know their stuff. So
Yeah.
so anyway, um,
Oh yeah, the other magazine that I
oh,
still get, and they publish it four times a year, is the Jack Benny Fan Club magazine, which they've
I
been
need to
printing
get
that
that
since
too.
1980. Yeah,
Yeah.
but Laura Leibowitz, she gave me, she just sent me, just because she wanted to, I bound copies of her 3-volume Jack Benny books. Um,
Now,
yeah.
now, Harry, I have a question about Apatoon since we're kind of jumping all around here.
Mhm.
I remember I had trouble getting into Apatoon, so I have a few issues just because there's always extra ones around here and there, but I never could become a member. Oh, boo, and so were you? And what years were you a member, and what had happened? If because obviously they don't do it now, right? I don't think they do any
We
APAs now.
a few years ago, it finally wound down.
Okay.
Yeah, it was another thing where it had to kind of figure out what it should be in the digital era, and it eventually became a CD-ROM based publication.
Hmm.
And that was like APAs are entirely dependent on finding somebody to be the central mailer and do a lot of work with no
Right.
glory. And my good friend Bob Miller was the last one to do that. And when he couldn't do it anymore, he asked for volunteers and nobody volunteered. But I belonged from 1982 until, I don't
What
remember
is
exactly.
Apatoons? Can
Yeah,
somebody
well,
explain to me?
sure. Well, and for people who don't know what an APA is, that stands for Amateur Press Association. And this is an idea which I believe goes back to the 19th century, back when, long before the Xerox machine, where if you were going to put out a small press magazine, you probably had a tiny printing press, and you had to do typesetting yourself. And basically the idea is that you have a bunch of people who want to put out a very low circulation publication of their own on a given topic. Back in the day, there were a bunch of them on comics. Apatoons was about animation. There were probably ones about almost any interest anybody could have. And everybody who was involved would create their own little magazine, which usually was a few pages. Some people put out remarkably fancy, thick ones. And it would be collated every so often. And in the case of Apatoons, it was every other month. And we would all send our copies to a central mailer who would then collate them all into one publication and staple them, and then send out one copy to each member. The reason it was hard to get in was because I believe that the membership roster was limited to 25 people.
Yeah.
And there could be waitlisters, and we had a few honorary members like Mike Barrier and Leonard Malton.
Yeah.
And but the idea was to be kind of exclusive, and I'd say quite a number of our members were industry professionals, and they were understandably kind of cautious about speaking their mind in this tiny circulation publication and having to get back to the industry. So they kind of like that it was a little secret. And we had a number of central mailers over the years. It was started by a guy named Don Markstein, who later wrote Disney Comics, and his wife, Gigi Dane. And Jerry was the central mailer for a while. My friend Dave Mackey was. I did it. Another friend, Kip Williams, and Kathy Doyle did it. And I think Bob did it twice and was the last one who did it. And yeah, at the end, it was a CD-ROM, which was kind of not quite as fun as waiting by the mailbox for this really thick magazine that after a while, it got to be so thick, it was like 2 volumes every other month.
How long did it run?
It started in 1981, and I mean, it lasted until maybe a little over 10 years ago. I mean, it lasted well into the century, and there was all kinds of great stuff in there that none of us had seen. And like, Jim Corcus, after a while, we had this tradition that Jim's zine was always the first one, because he was sort of the elder statesman of animation fandom, and he would run all kinds of fantastic stuff. And you'd get to people like Milt Gray talk about working in the industry in the 1960s and knowing people like Bill Teitla. And again, a lot of this was before animation websites existed, and so if you weren't going to read this stuff in Apatoons, you might not know about it at all. And
I'm just curious, is there a way to put those issues out on the Internet Archive?
Well, there are 2 issues with doing that. One of which is just scanning would be tough, particularly because these are stapled. But even bigger than that, we always had this rule that you were not supposed to share it. I'm sure people sometimes did share it, and we would send out extra copies to prospective members. And we also put out a few issues that were designed to be like freely available. But for the most part, it was confidential. And I've had people ask me about making them all available. And there are still members who really don't want these things they wrote 20 to 30 years ago to be publicly available. Fred Patton, who was like another legend of animation fandom, I believe gave his collection to a library, and you can probably find out a way to get in there and read that if you're serious about it. And I'd love to think that eventually they might all be available. And I do have digital copies of 1 or 2 issues we did for general availability, and I should see if those are on the archive, and if they're not, I'll put them there.
Or like, you think you could put it based on article based? Like, for example, if you would be willing to put out the article
right.
you wrote.
I could conceivably put up every issue I did, and some of the ones I did I have digitally, because in the early days, I did it on a typewriter, but eventually most of us would just like send like a PDF to the central mailer.
I'm just curious. It seems kind of strange that you'd have something that limited to 25 people. It seems like it would piss off a lot of people.
You probably did.
It didn't piss me off. It just was, I was always on the perpetual mailing list because, you heard the big names, it's like, I don't have a spot because Leonard Maltin's on there, they're not going to bump him for me. It's like, even now they wouldn't do that. The question I had about it is,
it just seems like something that would piss somebody off.
Well, you probably did, but those are the breaks. I'll talk about the one I was a member of in a second, but is there anything in your memory of all the years of Apatoons that was like, I mean, without revealing it, I guess, is there anything historical in there, like any interviews that might just be lost to time because they're just in that, or any juicy information or gossip that's only in that because it's in that? To your knowledge?
I mean, people definitely ran interviews, people like Jim, who had done a bunch of them. I remember, I mean, some of this I think came out eventually. I remember there was stuff about basically the fact that Chuck Jones and Bob Clampett were not happy with each other, and there was the letter that Chuck wrote complaining about Bob, and I think like Tex Avery had a copy and scrawled his support for Chuck on that, and we saw that years ago. I think that's out there now.
Oh yeah, that's out on Mike Barrier's website. Oh yeah.
I'd say we got early access to a lot of cool stuff that later came out, and some people have put out stuff that originated in Apatoons. Like Keith Scott wrote about the fact that Foghorn Leghorn was not originally an imitation of Senator Claghorn, which was an amazing discovery at the time, and he eventually posted online that article he had written for Apatoons.
Yep, he posted that on Cartoon Research.
Mark Mayerson, who was another great fan, who's done some great stuff, I believe has posted some of his
I imagine writings. Some of Jim's animation anecdotes have scrolled from the ranks of Apatoons too, right?
I think so. I think if you look at his more recent contributions, you will find some of the material he wrote for us way back when. I mean, Jim has always kind of specialized.
Is it all forbidden gossip, or was it just articles and various things that could be?
It was basically anything people wanted to do. So back in the day, we would write reviews. I mean, in the early 80s, animation was sort of starting to come out of this long slumber, and there were people like Don Bluth and Ralph Bakshi who were at least trying to do interesting stuff. And this was before The Little Mermaid came out. And in 1981, TV animation was a vast wasteland, but a few years later, there were things like the new Mighty Mouse that got interesting. So we were doing this at a time in animation was kind of going from being pretty terrible to at least slightly interesting. And so, of course, we wrote a lot about the good old days. Another thing that was really kind of unifying was this was also the period where people were getting their hands on VCRs, and we would all kind of like wake up early and tape record cartoons off of WTBS at 6 in the morning and discuss them. And APAs had these things called mailing comments, which is basically you read an issue, and then the next issue, you have a section of your zine where you comment. And so we would all comment on each other's zines, and it was really sort of like forum postings, except they only came out once every 2 months, and they were probably a little bit more civilized. We certainly did occasionally have disputes between members, but for the most part, it was a pretty friendly and constructive environment.
The reason I'm asking about interviews is like when I was doing my Patty Freeling book, the one person that apparently was never interviewed by anybody. And, if you say, oh, yes, it was in the APA, then I'd be like, wow, Holly Pratt.
Ooh.
Seemingly was never sat down for an official interview. I mean, I've talked to people like Art Leonardi. Oh yeah, I used to sit with him all the time and talk about things. Was there ever a tape recorder? No, things like that. So so I was hoping.
I imagine like landmark things like that would probably have been reprinted by now.
Not necessarily.
Right?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it depends. I mean, whoever did the interview, they may not be around, so they don't necessarily give their blessing. So it's just kind of lost in that limbo.
I'm trying to remember when Holly Pratt died. Was he still around when kind of the animation fandom started to boom?
Look it up while we're talking.
Alexa, when did Holly Pratt die?
Not seeing.
Oh,
No, Alexa, shut up. That was
uh,
not the right one.
Alexa never knows anything.
I
Anyway,
sometimes regret the fact that when I was talking to people like Seamus and Maurice, that I didn't like tape record the entire conversations. Although in both cases, both of those guys were interested in so many topics that we did not just sit around and talk about animation. We talked about all kinds of stuff.
1999. So
Okay, so he could have been interviewed.
yeah, but like I said, I asked everybody, and it's like, no, it's like, wow, you'd think the guy who designed the Pink Panther would have been interviewed at some point, but maybe Frizz and David were the de facto go-tos, and sometimes art. I don't know. Anyway, I'll mention my APA. The one that I was a member of is WTFB, which is Where the Fun Begins, and it was about the Disney afternoon. So ours was a little different than Apatoon's, although the format was the same. We would make like 25 copies, and there was a central mailer. But the focus, I tended to write historical pieces on Disney because that's where I'm at. But there's other people that just wrote fan fiction. And most of the fan fiction was about, Gummy Bears or, Goof Troop or whatever, Chippendale, what Rescue Rangers, those shows. But I asked the de facto leader, I said, well, I don't want to write about those shows, even though that's what the fanzine's about. Can I write one about Mickey Mouse? Because there's no Mickey Mouse show on the Disney afternoon. They go, sure. And so I wrote a fiction piece, which was called Horace Horsecollar's Dilemma. And it was supposed to be like a lost 1930s Mickey Mouse script, as it were, as a story. And, yeah, it was like that.
Can I say something about this real
Pirates.
quick? I bought this for $6 because the guy who was running the bookstore was not paying attention.
Wow.
Wow.
He was on his phone and I'm like, can I buy this? He's like, sure. I'm like, how much do you want for it? He's like, oh no, $6. Okay, great.
Wow. Anyway, so but that WTFB, let's see, it started sometime in the 90s and it went probably about 10 years.
Kappa Alpha was this really famous
That's
comics
another one. That's right.
APA that I assume no longer
I've heard of
exists.
that one.
Mike Barrier was a member of that, like in the 60s, and there actually are at least a few issues of that. There, if you go to these websites that have public domain comics, at least one of them has a fanzine section, and that has some early Kappa Alphas, including like the earliest issues of Funny World, even before it was called Funny World.
Do these kinds of magazines still exist?
APAs, I'm betting there are probably some APAs out there, maybe. Although again, kind of everything that you would go to an APA to in the past, the web now does in a much faster, more practical fashion. Although, I mean, I've been talking about maybe doing like a special revival issue of Apatoons and inviting everybody, whoever belonged, to contribute, and maybe even people who didn't belong, but who are people of our type, like you two. There is an Apatoons Facebook group, which is not super duper active, but is still a place where we continue to talk about stuff.
I would say, social media has probably replaced it. I mean, if somebody really wanted to do it, like Kamden, if you really wanted to do it, you get 25 of your friends, tell them to write something, make 25 copies and ship it to you, then you put them all together and ship them back out. That's as simple as that. But it's like, for what purpose, I don't know. Well, yeah. I'm trying to think the only other reason. Well, the one thing I remember on the Apatoons issues that I got like 2 or 3 of them, it seems like. One of them, and it might have been one, you said there was like some public samplers. I think one of them was that.
We put them together for the San Diego convention.
Yeah, I know I got one of those. And somebody went to the trouble of putting an actual animation cell.
Oh my gosh.
Animation cell. You remember that?
Jerry would put cells in all the time. He
so I was like, that would be the purpose of doing an APA now, is if you did something totally unique. And I remember there's also, I don't know if it was Animato or if it was in Animania, I think it was Animato, is that column called A Little Bird Told Me.
Yes.
I remember this vividly just because, I just as soon watch blah blah blah. I can't even remember the film, but I remember the other part. I just as soon cut up a copy of a film copy of The Secret of Nim, and so there's like a little, like 3 or 4 frames of the film scotch taped to the page. I thought that was hysterically funny.
Jerry had a stack of Possible Possum cells, if you remember this
Yeah, yeah.
terrible Terry Toons character. So he put Possible Possum cells in, and then we had another great member named Dave Bennett, who is a fantastic cartoonist, and he worked for the Rick Reinert Studios, who did a lot of stuff back then. And so he started sharing lots of Rick Reinert cells. And then eventually Dave did an original cell for our cover for like one of our anniversary issues. So yes, that's the kind of thing that is really cool and what you can't really do online.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
then people would also send other things through. Like I remember there was this Bullwinkle's restaurant chain,
Yep.
and Mike went to a Bullwinkle's restaurant and like he stole like 30 menus and ran them through.
I could have
And
done that.
anything you could get 25 or 30 copies of, you would
Yeah.
send through.
My only copies of Animato are actually June Foray's copies of Animato.
Oh wow.
Are they the
cool.
full
It's
size
cool to
one
think,
or the digest?
They're the full size ones.
Oh,
wow,
okay. All right.
I mean, it's cool to think that June even had those. That's fun.
She had a couple of them. I think it might not have been Animato. It was one of the ones where Bill Scott's interview was reprinted, which I know Jim.
That was Animato. That was an Animato.
Jim
Yes.
reprinted that interview though everywhere. It was
Yes.
reprinted in Hogan's Alley. It was reprinted in that Frostbite Falls fan magazine, right?
Yes.
I have June's copy of that magazine.
I will say this about Jim Korkis. When he writes an article, he gets good mileage out of it. Because for Harvey, he wrote an article about the Harvey superheroes that were created by Jim Steranko. And that thing appeared in my fanzine, but it appeared everywhere. It's like he told me, this is like the 5th place this has appeared.
But you gotta hand it to him. Yeah. I think he does edit every time. He edits and adds more each time.
Oh yeah, he does. I'll agree.
Like,
yes,
for
yes.
Cartoon Research,
yeah.
Jerry has told me the first time I met Jerry Beck, which I told the story before. The very first thing Jerry told me was I was showing Craig Cawson, Chuck's grandson, the issue of Film Comment with Bugs Bunny on the cover, and he'd never seen it. And Jerry walks up to me, and the very first thing he's ever says to me is, "I bought that the first day it came out. That's how old I am." But and then he just walks away. But
sounds like Jerry.
But he told me that Jim writes and he's the one who puts things out the fastest. Like he has backlogs for like weeks and months from now for Cartoon Research.
Jim had at least one zine in every issue of Appatoons for decades. I think maybe he finally broke his streak, but he was our most prolific contributor.
But I know that right now for Cartoon Research, I know he's doing that suspended animation. It's really like a stretch of all of the stuff. And by the way, another thing that came out is when I was helping Amber with her documentary, we came up to the idea of doing Bill Scott, and I had this idea. I'm like, Keith Scott can do an impression of everything. What if you got Keith Scott to do a Bill Scott impression, narrating pieces of Jim Korkis's interview that we wanted to use but we couldn't use but Keith wouldn't do it.
What do you mean you couldn't use them? Because the family said no?
No. It's just that Amber.
Oh, you couldn't use them because they were audio clips. They weren't audio clips. I mean,
right, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
But
I thought you
think there's a scene
kept from saying it because there's some juicy.
He wants to make a second part, and the second part is just about Jay Ward. And I think she's going to narrate a lot of that. Which I think Harry, he asked you about being in.
Yeah. Have you seen it, Harry? Have you seen the Bill Scott one?
Amberson, oh yeah, gosh, I love that. And in fact,
he was there at the premiere.
Yes, I helped Amber.
Whoops.
I helped Amber out a little bit with it, and then I went to that Zoom premiere and got so excited that I remembered I had been working on this long article about the Bullwinkle statue, which I had kind of got to be so overwhelming. I put it aside for a while, and Amber's documentary came out just a little bit before the 60th anniversary of the Bullwinkle statue. And so I was so inspired by Amber that I worked to finish this monstrous article on the Bullwinkle statue in time for the anniversary. And so
I was really surprised and pleased that I got credited on that thing.
Oh yeah. Well, you definitely helped. And originally it was just going to be about these elbow prints that were at the base of the statue, and are still there at the former J-Word studio. And then I started digging into the history of the statue itself, which led me to research this Sahara casino sign across the street with this rotating showgirl, which the Bullwinkle statue was riffing on. And so I kind of couldn't stop researching it. And by the time I was done, it was like the longest thing I've ever written, and full of stuff which I don't think people knew. And I guess the highlight was that Keith Scott said he learned stuff from it. And if you can write about Jay Ward and Keith learned
Skip
something.
Craig, I called Skip Craig afterwards, and I'm like, "You've got to read this."
Yes.
This is before, I think he just has gotten on the internet now. He just has now entered Facebook. I'm like, I called his son Jeff. I'm like, print this out, give it to him. And I do know that he has told me that he pulls out that article and he pulls out the interview I did occasionally.
That means a lot. I also got a nice note from Bill Scott's son, John. So
yes,
it's probably the most highly praised thing I've read. Neil
Gaiman
retweeted it, and Michael McKean retweeted it.
I can tell you that right now, though. I think it was Amber who shared it with Bill Scott's son.
Ah,
I shared it with Amber, and Amber knows Bill Scott's son, John. So I think that was probably her.
I'm sure it was.
It seems like I've seen this, but where did it appear?
It appeared on my website, harrymccracken.com,
okay,
which these days I update only very occasionally. So that's like the only thing I put up there in quite a while. But I redesigned my whole site to give it a beautiful treatment. And I have another article which is sort of like that one in that it has an animation connection without really being about animation, which I hope to put some effort into and get it up there.
How long now? I have to ask you about your tech thing. Do the people you work with in the tech world know that you're this kind of animation nerd, and then vice versa?
Sometimes
it's like you're like a Jekyll and Hyde thing going on right now.
Right. I don't make any attempt to hide it, for sure. I also don't like run around the office talking about Holly Pratt or anything like that. My boss the other day made a Tex Avery reference over Slack to me, so apparently he was thinking about it. And he also told me that growing up he loved Bedknobs and Broomsticks and the Disney Robin Hood cartoon. When I left PC World, where I had worked for like 13 years, they had this nice going away party. And they commissioned this great artist who drew for us to do this beautiful portrait of me, my Mazda 3 car, which was new at the time, and Scrappy, which I still have and treasure. So every so often, people pay tribute to my love of cartoons. But
I think when I first met you, probably by email, or some other way, I don't remember, is like I said, are you the same Harry McCracken, that does this? Because I knew you one way or the other way, it's like, and you said, yeah, it's me. So,
and I do occasionally write about animation. I wrote something on about Goldie Blocks, which is this brand of entertainment aimed at kind of inspiring little girls to be techies. And the founder's grandmother was, oh my gosh, I'm spacing her name, but she was a designer at UPA and designed the kind of the familiar version of Mr. Magoo, who's a little cuter and rounder that we all know. And so that was actually on Fast Company and discussed animation a bit.
Now, I try
not to. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I was going to say, is Fast Company the current magazine you're still working with? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
I work at Fast Company, and we actually still do have a magazine, and like Appatoons, it comes out 6 times a year. But we also have a website, and we do events and podcasts and videos and everything.
Because I thought I still see it on the stands,
still out there.
Don't necessarily read it, I hate to say, but that's
stands. I don't even think they have magazine stands anymore.
Well, do you have a Barnes and Noble there? That's where I get everything, and they still have a plentiful supply. Although I don't understand this, we're talking about magazines that have outstayed their welcome or just continue publishing. I don't understand how there's so many needlepoint magazines. I mean, is there really that much?
I'm going to tell you this right now. I'm a librarian, Harry, and I constantly am telling Mark, like today, I had to go in the back. I went to the bathroom and there was some little brat wrote a nice little note from the bathroom wall writing the words "Avenge me" on it with some useful things in the stall that I don't want to go near or touch.
I saw a good article the other day about the fact that essentially newsstand magazines are kind of secretly becoming books because there are all these things that are like cost $15 and are a nice paper, and it's like a tribute to Bob Saget. There have been a whole bunch of Disney ones, a whole bunch of
there was the Times did the Schultz the Time magazine did the Schultz,
yes,
Charles Schultz.
when I worked at Time, I worked on several of those, and in fact, here's kind of a cute story. When I worked at Time, we did one called the 100 most influential people who never lived, which was a spin on this most influential people franchise we did. And they asked me if I wanted to contribute, and I said that sounds like a lot of fun. And they sent me this long list of candidates, and these are all fictional people. And I narrowed it down to the list of, they said, would you like to do two? And I started by narrowing it down to Wonder Woman, Mary Richards, Pinocchio, and Lucy Ricardo. And I decided ultimately that I had the most to say about Pinocchio, who at least is a cartoon character, and Lucy Ricardo. So I wrote those up and sent them into my editor. And then eventually my print copy of the magazine came out some weeks or maybe a couple of months later. And so I already knew what these two things I had written looked like. So my first question was, who did they get to write about Wonder Woman and Mary Richards? And I opened it up, and the Mary Richards profile was written by Mary Taylor Moore. And you may be able to guess who wrote about Wonder Woman.
Linda Carter, I guess.
Linda Carter. So after I turned down those two assignments, they got Mary Taylor Moore and Linda Carter to write about them. And then at the back of the magazine, there were little biographies of all the authors, and I was right next to Mary Taylor Moore. And so I can honestly say that we worked together on something sort of, and our names appeared together.
That's cool.
And it was way more cool that they got Linda Carter and Mary Taylor Moore to do these than if I had done them.
By the way, Mark, to answer your question, so when I'm shelving magazines, there are so many quilting magazines, but they'll market magazines will market things, the quilting magazine, for a certain area. And I think the theory is they're all old people. They're all old people. Yeah. But
how-to
they're all
stuff
people at least 20 years older than you are. But
hopefully
these magazines are about this thick.
Yeah.
And you can barely put them on the shelf. Versus like a Time magazine. I think Time, as the New York Times gotten smaller, the New York Times magazine gotten smaller.
Generally speaking, almost every magazine has. And when I worked at Time, it was a weekly.
I mean,
and now it's bi-weekly.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Time is
pages versus 32.
Yeah, it's fewer pages because there's not as many ads, right. And it's also slightly smaller. They've condensed it down, not tremendously. It still looks like a magazine, but so they didn't bring it down to a comic book size. But still, you can see them shaving off millimeters left and right.
When I worked at PC World, we had a circulation of more than 1 million, and if you shave a tiny bit of the size of the paper, there's just like a 1/16 of an inch or something times 1 million copies. That actually saves a lot of money. And we would also occasionally go to cheaper paper, and after a while you could read what was ever on the other side of the page. And when your press run is that large, it saves quite a bit. But I'd say today a lot of the publications that are still doing okay are the ones that actually do have kind of nice production values. If you look at Fast Company, it's on good paper, and we have nice photography, and
but I noticed a lot of magazines,
and we're able to charge enough to make money just from the readers, because the advertising business is not what it used to be.
Magazines seem to also combine different subjects. Garden and Gun was a magazine before, but Birmingham Garden and Gun,
right?
And they would combine different subjects constantly. And I have to ask Harry though, have you ever written for a comic book or for animation?
I'd say the answer is no to both. I'm trying to think of, I never even read a letter to a comic book as far as I can remember. And I definitely have not written for animation. I've occasionally wondered if I should try to write stuff.
I've written some comic book stories, but no, I haven't written for animation. So
we had quite a number of people in Apatoons who did at least some comics writing, and some folks like David Gerstein, and I guess I first met David when he wrote a fan letter to Animato when he was still in school, and it was fun to see him actually start to write comics. And Don Markstein, as I mentioned, wrote quite a few.
Don Markstein's website, the World Encyclopedia of Cartoons,
The Toonipedia, yeah.
Yeah, I love that website is still active.
Yes, it went down.
It did go down
about a year ago, and David and I kind of panicked since Don was no longer around to to pay the domain and hosting fees, and we made contact with one of Don's daughters, and it turned out she was extremely interested in keeping it going, and so she sat down and paid the fee, and it's still out there.
Yes, I appreciate that it's still out there. That's a really useful tool.
Speaking of,
I love it. I always love that he had a link for everything in the website. Like he'll make slide jokes, and it would be like, Uncle Sam. Then it's like, not this Uncle Sam or this Uncle Sam.
Right.
Don was always a really engaging and fun writer, and it's nice to know that there's this kind of huge repository of his writing that's readily available, and people are actually looking at, because if you Google for a lot of these obscure cartoon characters, the Toonipedia might be one of the first things you see.
It's always the first thing you see. Like even on Wikipedia, if you go to Wikipedia articles to learn more and better information, go to this website. It's always that website.
Yep. So quickly, one of the members of WTFP, David Gerstein. I bet you didn't know that. So he was a APA member, and he did some fan fiction. He did a little of both. He did some fan fiction. He did some historical articles. He didn't get to be the level he is now, where he knows every little solid thing possible about Oswald the Rabbit or whatever. But it's like you could tell, because he was in his early 20s at the time, you could tell he was getting in that direction. So it was kind of interesting.
I emailed David when I did this article on Ralph Heimdall, which thankfully will have a sequel, for Cartoon Research, where I went in because Harry, I don't know if you saw it, my article I wrote, but
no, I have to track it down. That sounds great.
St. Cloud, Minnesota archives. I'm a library science major, so archives really interest me. St. Cloud, Minnesota University accessed Ralph Heimdall's daughter's entire collection.
Oh, wow.
And they have this great collection of original art and everything, and I profiled the whole story. And I asked Harry, okay, I'd like some extra info, and then I also profiled a little bit. Billy Ireland had a little bit too. So I profiled them a little bit too, because I've been over to that museum. It's wonderful.
That's great.
They gave me the grand tour behind the scenes too. But
I grew up on that Bugs Bunny newspaper strip that was kind of like set in an alternate universe, where the characters all looked a little different.
I refer to the comic books as Earth 2, and I refer to the comic strip as Earth 3.
And like Sylvester was kind of like was he like a hobo with a British accent or something?
Kind of like Wimpy.
Right. He would call people governor.
I forgot about that. That's funny.
And but Martha Slavin, his daughter, emailed me contacted me a few weeks ago, and she really liked what I wrote.
I will find that, because I would love to know more.
But David, I asked him, like, okay, what do you know? And within like 5 seconds, he gives me this whole this list, and I'm like, thanks.
I have David. I've often gone to David with questions on Scrappy and Columbia. Sometimes people ask me about them because they assume I will know, and when I don't, David, generally speaking, does.